Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Madeline Milka, President and CEO of APAICS, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our APAICS in Conversation. We'd like to welcome Nisha Biswal, who is President of the U.S. India Business Council and Senior Vice President for South Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. She previously served as Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asian Affairs in the U.S. Department of State from 2013 to 2017. And she previously served as Assistant Administrator for Asia at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. She also spent over 10 years on Capitol Hill serving as Staff Director on the State Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee and the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives. We're also glad to see Audrey Tauscher again with us. She is moderating today. She is an energy policy regulator analyst with special focus on supporting the Japanese and U.S. energy industry as they forge relationships on issues of mutual interest. So thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of this conversation.
Thank you, Madeline, and thank you, Nisha. It's always great to see you. So Nisha, you've had a very impressive career in public service. So can you take us through your path?
Sure, and Audrey, it's so wonderful to see you and to be here at APAICS. I have been fortunate in having just a very varied career here in Washington and in international relations. I started out, in college, not really knowing what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go, and stumbled into an opportunity working for a public relations firm. And I think that was one of the foundational experiences that I had because I learned the importance of communication. In writing and speech writing and dealing with the media and giving speeches. And so that has kind of set me up for the rest of my career. But really my love of foreign policy and international affairs kind of got its start in my second job, which is that during the Rwanda crisis and the genocide, I was very impacted by the fact that all of these things were happening and I didn't have a way of being involved. And so I quit my job at the PR firm that I was with and went to the American Red Cross and volunteered there. Started as a volunteer for about 6 months before they kind of took pity on me and offered me a job. And that is really how I got my start in international affairs, working on humanitarian policy and programs. And from there, it's just been kind of one after another of different experiences that have built on each other, working with the Red Cross, going overseas with the International Red Cross, coming to USAID, and then from there, going to Capitol Hill, working in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And then in the most recent iterations during the Obama administration, coming in as the head of Asia for USAID, and then as a diplomat at the State Department handling South and Central Asian affairs. Today, I'm at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and I run the U.S. India Business Council, amongst other things. And so it's been kind of building blocks throughout.
That's very impressive. And I think it's really interesting, or impressive is the word I want to go back to, because you did all that not from a plush office inside the building in Washington, D.C., but you were actually overseas in some fairly not so developed areas. So, that's really amazing. Now, as you mentioned, you're now at the U.S. Chamber as president of the U.S. India Business Council. Can you tell us what your mission is there?
Sure. Fundamentally, when I was at the State Department, when I was AID, I saw the incredibly important impact that the private sector plays in supporting economic development and in advancing our diplomatic ties with the country. And so when I left the Obama administration, it seemed like a natural stepping stone for me to then try to engage the private sector, particularly in how we could deepen our trade and economic partnership with one of the largest economies in the world and the largest democracy in the world, which is India. Historically, the US and India have not had as strong and as deep an economic partnership. And so that's my mission at USIBC, is really to expand the US India trade corridor.
Great. And now we're facing the COVID-19 pandemic, and that has global implications. So how does that play out in the Chamber's missions? And what are your perspectives as a former diplomat and USAID official?
Yeah, it's, it's something we've never seen before, at least in our lifetimes, which is a crisis that is not just a health crisis, it's a humanitarian crisis, it's an economic crisis, and it's not isolated to one geography, it's actually global in nature. There's not a continent on the planet, with maybe the exception of Antarctica, that has not been affected in some way by this pandemic. And normally in a disaster, in a crisis scene, you surge people and you surge resources to the scene of the crisis, whether it's surging medical teams to sub-Saharan Africa during the Ebola outbreak, or surging relief teams to Japan and Indonesia during the tsunami, or, here, the surging part of it is what is impacted, because the fundamental need in the pandemic is social distancing. And so that has been a challenge. And then the fact that it is global in nature. So everyone is dealing with it virtually at the same time. That has really tested our response capacities as not only as a US government or a USAID, but really globally, every government has been, and every relief organization, response organization has been tested because of that. And then on top of all of that, it has been a deeply disruptive economic crisis. Because as you essentially bring social and economic life to a standstill, the impact on our livelihoods, the impact on industries, on enterprises, even the largest of enterprises are being impacted in dramatic and devastating ways. The impact on our small and medium-sized businesses in the United States and around the world is just catastrophic. So this is something we've never seen before, and something that it's going to take us time to really develop the analytics and the initiatives that are going to help us find our way out of it.
Yeah, it's just such a the implications are just so wide reaching, as you mentioned, health-wise and economics-wise, and then resource-wise with people and equipment. So what's the difference between the way our administration and the Modi administration are approaching the pandemic?
So India, I think, saw what was happening in the United States, and particularly when the virus was really accelerating in New York City. And I think it really brought the Indian response into sharp focus. India acted dramatically and acted early to shut down the entire country. That national lockdown was essentially announced about a week or so after the United States really started practicing social distancing, and the crisis in New York became headline news. I think I had been working from home for 1 week, and then the Indian lockdown was announced. So it was quite early in terms of the number of cases that India itself had actually experienced. But what I think the Modi government was quite taken aback by was how rapidly the virus spread in New York and how it overwhelmed the city's response capacities in the hospitals and in the first responders. And India, of course, seeing the dense population and resource constraints that it experiences, decided that it needed to really act decisively, and that's what they did. You've seen the virus starting to gain some footholds in India in certain urban populations like Mumbai, parts of New Delhi, Pune, Calcutta, etc. But it has been largely constrained in many other parts of the country. So while India's been on lockdown for 2 months, they are now categorizing their response into red, green, and yellow zones. So the red zones are where there is a high level of pandemic, and those will stay closed. And then parts of the country that have no incidence of COVID-19 will start opening up, and then more caution in some of the places where you have lower levels. But what you've seen is kind of a national approach with some state flexibility and variability. India, like the United States, is very much a federated society or governance, but India has taken much more centralized action. And in the United States, it has been much more of a state-led response. And so you see a high degree of variability in the United States on what the response has been in New York versus Alabama, or, across the country. And I think that is a little bit of a cultural thing as well, because I think India is used to a very national crisis and or security response, and the United States is, I think, much more. Every state wants to be able to, make its own determinations, and I think the administration also has not exhibited the kind of very aggressive, decisive, centralized response either.
Yeah, I think in the U.S., seen a lot of eagerness to open up is driven by economics. The U.S. government, as we all know, is providing some stimulus assistance to people and to businesses. Is India also doing something similar?
So the Prime Minister, the very first set of stimulus announcements that the Modi government announced, and it came about a week or 10 days into the first lockdown, was exclusively oriented towards vulnerable populations, ensuring that the labor class, that women, that people at the bottom of the pyramid had the food subsidies and food distribution mechanisms, that they had the ability to address income disruption, etc. But just this past week, and in fact in the last 3 or 4 days, the Prime Minister and his team have announced more far-reaching economic stimulus to address the bigger economic disruptions. And by some counts, they've announced measures that account for about 10% of GDP, which is just a massive amount from Indian standards. We're still doing a lot of the analysis around that. I think the question is how much of that is going to really help support Indian industry, which has taken a real beating through this whole lockdown, and how much of it is going to support other larger government programs. So those are the kinds of questions that we're asking, and that Indian companies are asking, because there are a lot of businesses in the US, in India, and around the world who are not likely to make it as a result of the severe disruptions that they've been experiencing.
Yeah, you need people to run the economy, so you have to balance them both. It's a hard thing to do. So what are the fastest growing markets in India?
Well, prior to the pandemic, India was one of the largest fast growing economies, or the fastest large economy in the world. And, when Prime Minister Modi came in his first term, he came in under a mandate and a mantra of economic governance and creating the modern India. Now, I think the pace of reforms has certainly slowed down in recent years as he went into the elections for the second term. And then as he came out of those elections with another historic mandate, but really focused much more on remaking kind of the social landscape, political landscape, which I think created a fair amount of division within the country. what the pandemic has done is really position Narendra Modi to refocus on bringing the country together and to take a look at the economy. Growth sectors such as, it was the fastest growing aviation market, or second fastest perhaps after China. It was one of the fastest travel and tourism industries, really high growth education market. It was, across the board, healthcare market, across the board, because you had a fast growing economy, a large population base. It was growing across so many different sectors and segments. Today, the question in India is about, as the growth indicators have, of course, cratered in India as they have everywhere else, is how quickly will it be able to resume that? And a lot of that will depend on the steps that the government takes today. With all of the focus on US-China tension, there is a move in India to say, could we become in India a focus for supply chain and manufacturing investment? Can we attract companies to bring their manufacturing here? And it'll be a safer de-risking strategy to pursue. And I think that there is opportunity for that. But honestly, India is going to have to make some significant reforms in terms of its regulatory policies, in terms of its trade and tax policies, to be able to bring in that kind of investment. So those are the things we hope that the Indian government is looking hard at. And it's what I focus on through my job at USIBC in providing those kinds of recommendations. And hopefully we will see India kind of bounce back from this in the next 12 to 18 months.
Well, that's interesting. I think there are definitely going to be some opportunities, as you mentioned, for other supply chain type of support. And which leads me to my next question is, given the post-COVID environment, do you think there will be more or less opportunities for engagement by US corporations in India?
India is such an important partner for the United States, particularly during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, because in many ways, you think of India as the pharmacy of the world. India produces so many of the pharmaceuticals or components of pharmaceuticals, the APIs, that the rest of the world depends on. And I think some 60% of American drugs have some origin tied to India. And so that, I think, can be a real source of opportunity and growth for the US-India corridor as we think about not only collaboration in the manufacturing of existing pharmaceuticals, but if you think about the R&D collaboration for looking at, the potential new formulations that might be relevant to either this pandemic, this virus, in terms of treatment, in terms of vaccine development or test development, but also the future potential disease burden that we might encounter, and how can we deepen the collaboration between our two countries, deepen the research partnerships between our two countries to scale up and accelerate the development of new pharmaceutical products.
So it sounds like a lot of opportunities then for collaborative engagement.
Absolutely.
In the Obama administration, you served as the top diplomat for Central and South Asia in your post at the State Department. And during a congressional hearing where you were testifying, a newly elected member of Congress mistook you as a member of the Indian government and asked you some questions that weren't quite appropriate for your role. But that mistake was heard through the international press, including in India. So given that mistake, which was embarrassing both for him and for the committee, you handled it beautifully.
Well, thank you.
So that brings us to why it's important for Asians and people of color to be represented in U.S. government at all levels. So would you agree that that is important?
You know, one of the incredible strengths of this country is its diversity. And organizations like APAICS are so incredibly important in helping to advance the careers of Asian Americans, specifically the API community. If the way the United States is represented in its government, in its diplomats, in its ambassadors is not reflective of the diversity of the country, then it actually, I think, is a missed and a lost opportunity. So we've seen probably, particularly in the last decade and a half, just a real strong surge of representation for APIs in government in all kinds of roles. And so much of that is because of the work of organizations like this. And I can tell you that in our diplomacy, I got so many comments from very senior levels of government across not just India, but Bangladesh, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, where government officials would say, one, this could not happen in my country. Person from a different ethnic background wouldn't have the kind of opportunity that they have in the United States. And two, how well it speaks to the United States that people who represent, different ethnic backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, different countries of origin are able to represent the United States. I think it actually allows us to build deeper, stronger ties with many of these countries because they see a face and they see a background that is relatable to them, and they deepen the level of partnership as well. So I think these are things that accrue to the strength and the benefit of America, and it's because of organizations like APAICS that we're able to do that so effectively.
So you make a very good point then. The U.S. is not a homogenized country, and so we do have a lot of diversity. And so Nisha, again, using your diplomatic skills to make lemonade out of lemons. But that's true. I think that is what makes the U.S. unique, and that's why people like you were great to serve as a representative of the U.S. government to build ties in a region that you're very familiar with. And also, again, I want to highlight what you had mentioned. That's why organizations like AAPI are important and serve a really significant role in helping to diversify the U.S. government. You, as I mentioned, you served in the Obama administration, and now you work closely with the current administration. I did want to ask how this administration's America First policy impacts U.S. businesses trying to engage with India.
Well, when I was in government, I knew that I was working to advance the American interest, right? That's why the American people put me into that job. But I think the question is, how do you define the American interest? How do you define what our national interest is? And I think for centuries, America has really defined its national interest as being one that included a global agenda in advancing a larger circle of prosperity around the world. That when we see a more stable and prosperous world, America itself is more stable and prosperous. And that kind of an enlightened shared interest has really been the foundation of American foreign policy and American diplomacy. I think fundamentally, to say an America first in a binary way that says that my gain is your loss or your gain is my loss is I think missing the opportunity. And I think when we look at it from the U.S. Economic perspective and trade perspective, 60% of American growth is export-led growth, GDP, right? So if every country goes into a much more protectionist stance, America stands to lose as a result of it. So we want to keep markets open. We want to keep trade flowing, and that requires us also to maintain a open policy on trade. I think, of course, there need to be safeguards for American workers. There need to be, standards in terms of human rights and labor and environmental standards. But we want to see an America that prospers because it is engaging with the rest of the world.
That's great. And in fact, I have a question that came in that kind of fits in with that. The question is, aren't Indian-American relations thriving between the Modi and Trump administrations?
I think India is a very pragmatic country. I know that, during the Obama administration, I worked very hard along with the fantastic team at the State Department and Under Secretary Kerry to deepen the ties between the United States and India, and the Prime Minister had a very personal connection and bond with President Obama. He also took very strong and quick and decisive steps when President Trump was elected to build a relationship with President Trump. Fundamentally, the relationship between our two countries, between our two people, stems in a very broad-based set of values, aspirations, and foreign policy goals. And so whether it's President Obama, President Trump, before Obama, President Bush, and whomever the next president may be, I think that the Indian government and the Indian Prime Minister, whether it's Narendra Modi or down the road someone else, will look to the United States as a deep and important partnership, and perhaps its most important relationship. And you will see the relationship between the two leaders reflect that.
Great. We're almost out of time, but before we go, I wanted to end with the question of, in your opinion, what makes a resilient leader?
Wow, that's a really good question right now. I think that resiliency is, one, being able to acknowledge your shortcomings or your failings. Two, to be able to show your vulnerabilities, and then three, to be able to learn and grow from those failings and from those vulnerabilities. I think so often we are put under pressure to not show weakness, to always be strong, to always be successful, to always be right. But what builds the confidence, the understanding, and the support of your team is to actually be able to show your failings and to show your vulnerabilities and your anxieties, and to be able to demonstrate the strength to overcome those rather than to have never had those.
Great answer. So be human, basically.
Be human.
Great.
Be authentic.
Yes. Great. Thank you, Nisha.
Well, thank you, Madeline. It was wonderful to spend some time with you guys and to be part of this fantastic organization. Keep doing all the great work that you're doing and supporting the OPI community and making sure our voices are heard.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your insight and all of your experience. And thank you, Audrey, for joining us again as a moderator for today's APAICS in Conversation. Don't forget that this week we have a special edition for APOM, an APAICS in Conversation with KPAC members. So you'll be seeing 14 of them this coming Wednesday, May 20th, starting at noon. You still have time to register, so please click on apaics.org and register for this additional special edition. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and we will see you the next time.
Great. Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.